It's our community, you know, and we have the most interesting people to talk to. People that live right next door to us almost, and we don't even know them. And I have a feeling that you've seen this old fella before. Old fella.
I've been around too long.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And his name is Doug Frost. And Doug is a unique person in his field because he is a master sommelier.
Nicely done.
And thank you. And he is also a master of wine. And you became the 8th person to be the master of wine?
Yes, the 8th American.
Oh, the 8th American.
8th American. And so
you know, when I first met Doug, he was the sommelier at the American restaurant, and he went around with a little cup around his neck. I love that. It isn't big enough for a begging bowl, but it's
Nice.
big enough to
just a little sample.
That's right.
All we request.
And you're the one that does the tasting when you do that, rather than the person who orders the wine.
Well, no, I'm
No.
one of those people that really believes that the customer themselves should do it. So a lot of my fellows and a lot of people I really respect believe that the sommelier should taste it first. But I'm really I never wanted to do it that way, and never indeed really did it that way, because to me, if I looked at it this way, that if I taste the wine first and then I pronounce it good and then I serve it to the customer is then going to tell me that, you know, even if they don't like it, they're going to go, well, you know, this fancy sommelier told me it's good, so it must be good. And the issue is that we're not all the same. We don't all have the same tastes and likes and dislikes. And my whole thing at the American was, as much as possible, it was to make sure that every customer got something they liked. Yeah. So it didn't really matter if the wine, you know, was something to my liking. It mattered if it was to their liking.
To their liking.
So the trick for a sommelier like me, though, therefore, is that when I pull a cork, I have to kind of really have my sensors out, because there is a thing called TCA, which is an invisible sort of cork mold that doesn't, you know, it's not dangerous, but it makes the wine smell and taste not good. Oh. So when I pull the cork, and then I'm taking the cork off the corkscrew, I have to sit there and kind of, you know, do one of these.
So there are other things than turning to vinegar that make it not good.
Yeah, it's really true, and you know, so of course at that point, you know, I would try to figure out if there was any TCA. If I didn't smell any TCA, I would just pour it for the customer, and at that point let them make that decision.
See, aren't you impressed? And I have to tell you that Doug is only one of 3 people in the world to have both of these distinctions. So, and you know, he lives right here. And I think that's just wonderful. USA Today said this about him. They said, Frost likely knows as much as anyone in the world about how to make, market, serve, and identify wines.
That was,
I think
still
that's
need
really
to pay
nice.
that guy for that
I
quote.
know.
Seriously.
I know. What did you have to do? First of all, let's take the sommelier. What did you have to do to pass these rigorous tests that they give? Are they written? Are they what?
Well, in the beginning, the Master Sommelier exam is written. The first several parts. There's 4 levels to that exam, and so typically it takes people about 4 years to get through them. Although I would say actually the average is 5 years to get through the 2 exams.
Did it take you that long?
The 4 exams. Actually, no. It took me a little less. I was, you know, I'm one of those guys, you know, who likes to take tests. I think it's fun, you know, which is definitely wrong. Yeah. But it's the first level is a written exam. The second level is a blind tasting, service, and written exam. The third level is, again, the same, only the exams get bigger each time.
On how to manufacture, how to grow grapes,
Mostly
how to
just about here's the way the Master Sommelier exam works, because I'm one of those people that writes it now, because that's been, you know, 20 years ago. Is that we always look at it as what's the kind of question that someone could legitimately ask you in a restaurant, and what kind of answer you know should you have at the ready. So there's a lot of obscurity that shows up in this exam that, you know, you need to, as we tell people, be able to name the 1855 classification of Bordeaux estates backwards and forwards, you know, north to south. Grand Cru of Burgundy. I mean, basically, a customer should be able to ask you about any wine made anywhere in the world, and you should be able to say, I don't have that wine, but here's what I have that's like it. And that's whether it's a Romanian wine, a Japanese wine, a Sicilian wine, a Chilean wine, or a wine from Missouri or Kansas.
See, well, if you asked me and I would taste it, I'd say it's not vinegar, so drink it.
Well, I think you've got you have the attitude right. You know, the benchmark should be reasonable.
And how about the Court of Master Sommeliers? What is that different from what?
Well,
because I know you're a part of that too.
Yes, indeed. The Court of Master Sommeliers is simply the organizing and examining body that determines who becomes a Master Sommelier. Because at the final level, the largest exam is a service exam in which you spend about an hour serving, opening wine, decanting wine, pouring champagne, suggesting wines, and talking about wine with a group of Master Sommeliers who are your customers. And I should probably add, perhaps not the nicest customers in the world for that particular hour. So
that may be true.
Just
well, George Bernard Shaw said, and I thought it was so funny. He said, "A mind of the caliber of mine cannot get their nutrient from cows."
I like. Well, we like many of the things that man said.
I do. Well, I want to pull a thread out of something you just said. You're talking about Grand Cru, and I know that is good stuff. And talk about Grand Cru as a when you see, because you see it printed on the label.
Well, it is. I always have to admit to a flaw in the French system. And many of our classification systems are based upon the French model, because the French were the first really serious wine-producing country, and to this day probably have the greatest breadth, if you will, of great wines. Grand Cru is supposed to express manifest itself at the very top of a sort of pyramid of wines, with Vin de Table or table wines and Vin Ordinaire and such at the bottom, and that's these wonderful Grand Crus, or these great growths, if you will. The irony here is when we talk about Burgundy, Grand Cru is Grand Cru. I mean, these are hallowed sites that have been delineated for centuries, in some cases well over 1,000 years, as being the very best sites for the grape Pinot Noir, the grape Chardonnay. You move over to Bordeaux. Bordeaux is a completely different place. It was run by the British for 500 years, and so it's a bit more of a mercantile setup. So the term Grand Cru actually shows up in Saint-Emilion, a subregion of Bordeaux, for ordinary wines. Maybe not completely ordinary wines, but okay wines. And it makes me crazy, and it makes everyone crazy, especially if you're studying to be a Master Sommelier and you're trying to learn this stuff. Why is Grand Cru great over here, and here it's just okay? I don't understand.
I went to France one time, and we took a tour of the vineyards, and I can't remember if it was in Burgundy, the Burgundy country, or Bordeaux country, and I thought, oh, this is going to be awful, spending a whole day looking at grapevines. It was probably the most interesting day that I have ever spent, and whichever one it was, the Grand Cru only had one arm. You know, the grapevines are grown with two arms out where the grapes hang on.
And the Grand Cru,
I was in Burgundy. Thank you. And the Grand Cru only had one arm. They cut the other off so that the grapes would concentrate their effort in that one side.
Yeah, the thinking is always that each vine has only so much flavor to give, so make sure you can concentrate that flavor in a smaller number of grape clusters.
I thought that was sort of interesting, actually. Color. Wine different colors. How do you? I mean, some of it is light red, some of it is dark red, some of it is really dark. What's the difference?
Well, I'll go ahead and, if you'll forgive the pun, repeat an off-color joke, which was André Noblet, the great winemaker at Domaine de la Romanée-Conti, which is many consider the greatest estate in Burgundy, who said that color on a beautiful wine is as important as clothes on a beautiful woman, which is to say, you know, it's French, what can I do? But the idea is that some grapes, like Pinot Noir, don't have a lot of color. And so you'll look at this wine, and it'll look sort of pale, and you'll think, huh. And then you smell
Who
it
wants
and go,
pale wine?
Yeah, well, exactly. But actually, it can be fantastic. And wines, as they age, they lose their color. And a lot of us, you know, who've been around for a long time, we love older wines because they become more supple, they become more velvety, we hope. We hope they become more complex. And they will lose color. When you get a bottle of wine that has sediment...
Even though it hasn't been opened?
Exactly. A bottle of wine that has sediment in the bottom of it, which an older wine often will, that sediment is actually the color. So the color drops out, but also what drops out, what makes that sediment an important part of the aging process is the tannin has linked up with the color. Now tannin, a better way to put tannin is its bitterness, its astringency, its dustiness, have basically linked up with color and fallen to the bottom of the bottle. So now the wine isn't as dusty, bitter,
and you don't want to shake it up.
Oh, definitely don't want to shake it up.
Because I think that's a point need to be made.
It's true.
Because sometimes, you know, when you have a sediment at the bottom, you think, oh, swell, I'll shake that up and it'll,
and
it'll just be really good.
Yeah.
So, yes. But we mustn't shake. Must not shake. Okay. Well, I think then the whole point is we can't judge a wine by its color.
I agree.
Okay. Well, that's one point made. Another one is you taste it, and sometimes I want to go.
It's puckery and bitter and dusty. Well, I really think that that's tannin's work. Now, tannin has several different purposes, really. Now, tannin is really just a result of, if you will, color, in so much as this. Color, other than a handful of grapes, in the 100,000 different grapes out there, other than 5 or 6 of them, the color comes from the skins. The juice itself is clear, even though the grape is red. So you squish the grapes, you pour the juice away, and that's how a white Zinfandel is made, in essence. Zinfandel's a red grape, but they didn't leave the grape and the skins together. To typically make a red wine, you want to get all the color and all the flavor. That's a lot of it's in the skins.
So we leave the skins in red wine.
You leave the skins in there for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, something like that, and you'll get all the flavor, but you get that bitterness, that dustiness, that astringency. So the answer is twofold, if you will. Either you age it, like we described it, so the sediment falls to the bottom, or you have it with some food that's going to make it seem less bitter, dusty, and astringent. By itself, it's just bitter, dusty, astringent.
It is. Well, now, so tannin doesn't have anything to do with the residual sugar?
No, it really doesn't. It's tannin's purpose is it's if you will, an agent that helps that wine stay stable longer.
And the sugar comes from the meat of the grape.
It should indeed come from that. Now, there are certainly cases of people adding sugar, but typically, you don't want any of those. I mean, I've got a German wine over here, and the way they made that sweet, as it were, is by fermenting the grape juice, which has sugar in it, all the way to dryness, and then taking some of the grape juice that's unfermented and putting it into that bottle, so that the sugar came from the same site, the same fruit, if you will, that the wine came from.
So when we say the wine is a dry wine, it has less residual sugar?
Exactly.
And a sweet wine, of course, has more residual.
Yeah, it's always been a kind of a silly thing. It's a liquid, how can it be dry? But yeah, that's in essence what we're talking about, because it feels very dry to us, a wine without residual sugar. Our palates themselves are clock in at a pH, which describes, if you will, acidic versus basic, continuum in a scientific manner of speaking, by describing, negative ion charges. Basically, what we're saying is that when I taste a wine without any residual sugar, it's got a pH of like 3.6 or 3.8, or sometimes even lower, which is very acidic compared to our palates, which veer closer to the 7 pH mark. So it's decidedly dry. It feels dry to a normal mouth, and certainly a lot drier, let's say, than water, if you will, because it's acidic. It's tart.
Now I have to ask you a very personal question. Are you ready? Do you have a nose?
Well, I certainly have one. I think that, no, actually, to your point, Mary, I think my palate, though, in the Master of Wine and the Master Sommelier exams, particularly the Master of Wine final exam, which is, again, a series of 5 exams and dissertations and such, you're confronted with 36 wines. And you have to blind taste those wines and identify them by the grape or grapes, where they come from, what vintage they are, how they were made, what barrels they were fermented in, what barrels they might have been aged in, where that might have happened, whether it was a dry environment, a wet environment, and it's all there. And people always say, oh my God, you must have this amazing palate. And the answer is no.
No, you have a nose.
Well, and truthfully, no, I don't have a particularly good, typically speaking, any woman has a better sense of smell than I do. And so we're finally seeing women become a lot more successful in the Master Wine and Master Sommelier.
Do you think that sensory gift is more female?
I do. I think it's physiological. We know that men begin to lose their ability to regenerate the epithelial fibers, which provide the sense of smell, in their early 70s. And women don't really have that problem until their early 80s. So there is that difference, and there's certainly a cultural difference
and
as well.
I have to tell you, though, that, you hear people talk about wine, and they'll say, well, there's a little chocolate or a little banana or a little, I don't smell anything. And I don't know what those flavors, I guess it's a matter of experience.
I think it is. I think that one of the problems is, if you will, or maybe part of the allure of wine is that the sense of smell is hardwired to the brain. So you're not really, shall we say, when you smell something, we have not trained ourselves, unless you're a chef or unless you're a wine person or a perfumer or something like that. You haven't trained or stopped your brain, slowed it down to say, what is that? Instead, what we usually do is we go, oh, that smells good.
Yeah.
And that usually means, in my way of looking at it, it smells familiar in a good way.
Yeah.
You know, the Proustian notion of the Madeleine, you know, that cookie that brings
I
it.
love them. Yes.
Yeah, you know, and so here's what I'd
Yes.
say. What's your favorite meal? What's your absolute favorite meal? If you could just go out to lunch right now and have a killer meal, what would it be?
Pizza.
Pizza. Okay. Now, what's your favorite kind of pizza? Where do you get it?
Cheese pizza, and I don't think I ought to say.
Okay, fair enough. But right now, if I was to ask you to describe that cheese pizza to me,
Lots of cheese.
you could describe that in detail.
Oh, I
couldn't you?
could.
Exactly.
Yes.
And I think
Yes,
anybody
I
is
could.
like that. We actually have this incredible sense memory,
Yeah.
but we haven't often applied it to each glass of wine. That's the weird,
Okay, well,
abnormal part.
when I go out, you know, and you see people, and I know they don't know any more about it than I do, and the wine will be poured for the taste, and hold it up, and they twirl it around, and they smell it. Why do you twirl the wine around?
Well, it's actually fun to shall we?
Yes,
show
oh,
this?
please.
Okay, good.
Oh,
Right.
please.
Because what's happening in essence is you've got these congeners, which are flavor and aroma compounds that are attached to alcohol, and these congeners wake up, if you will. They volatilize in the presence of oxygen. So what you're trying to do when you swirl a glass of wine is you're trying to get oxygen to as much of that wine as you possibly can. And the best way to do that is to swirl it up the side of the glass so there's more surface volume. And as a result of that, you'll get more oxygen to it, and the wine will have a bigger smell. And certainly what I'll do is train people to swirl the glass and notice how it'll increase
Now, this
the
is
amount
not,
of volume.
this is a what kind of, where did
Well,
this
I
come
brought
from?
a Spanish wine. I just kind of randomly...
You like Spanish wines.
I like all wine. It's the truth, you know. But I think Spanish wine is really interesting right now. And as I was, considering the time of the year and such,
yeah.
I thought it might be fun to show a
Okay,
Spanish
now-
wine.
okay.
But even though I really want to talk about, local wines, Missouri wines, Kansas
Smells
wines.
good.
but- yeah, indeed. So that's the first thing. Does it smell familiar? Hence, does it smell like it's going to be okay?
Smells like wine.
Yeah, it smells like wine. So it smells like grape juice.
Yeah.
And what we'll usually do is we'll describe each of these glasses or each of these wines in the form of various fruits. So the first thing I'll ask people, does this smell more like black fruits or does it smell more like red fruits?
Black fruits.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? So it's more to me black cherry. And at that point, I'll suddenly fill in the blanks. It's like, well, if it's black fruits, then it must be blackberry, black cherry, maybe some plum, maybe cassis. What do you think? Do we get all the way to cassis? Cassis
You're
is
pressing. You're pressing.
well, and this is exactly why wine tasting and blind tasting
Yeah.
is both easy and difficult. You press until it becomes
Maybe
kind of
blackberry.
Maybe blackberry. Yeah, I don't think it gets to cassis either. It gets really close, but not quite. Now,
smells
then
good.
the next question I'll ask myself is, does it smell like raisins or prunes or dates or figs or anything? No, it really doesn't. And this is an area in Spain called Ribera del Duero, and this is exactly why blind tasting is possible. If this smelled more like raisins and prunes, it would be coming from farther south in Spain.
It'd be good for your system.
Well, yes, that's certainly true. But in addition to that, it
Yes.
would tell us that it's hotter, so the fruit got riper.
Oh.
And so the fruit, if you will, the smells of the fruit are more like overripe fruit, like prunes and dates and raisins and figs. But this is an area that's at 3,000 feet, so it cools off a lot at night. I've been to this area in the first week of July when the temperature during the daytime was 90 degrees and the temperature that night was 42. Now that's not what we experience around here. Their version of warm climate is very different than ours.
But that brings up a really interesting question while we're tasting this stuff.
And right now we're just smelling.
We're just
doing
smelling
the swirly
it.
thing.
Oh, yes, this is wonderful.
But
I
see,
just
and
feel
there's
like
the
such-
swirly thing, and now it smells more.
Yes,
You
it does.
It increases the
It
volume
does.
of the smell.
It does. No,
yeah,
that
it makes
is
it
true.
easier.
But we're talking about the temperature at 3,000 feet. We're talking about. We have a lot of local wines grown in Missouri. The grapes are Missouri and Kansas grapes. We're 500 feet above sea level.
Right.
We don't have a particular clay soil or what kind of. How can we grow grapes in Kansas and Missouri that make good wine?
Well, there are a couple things at play. One is that we actually have the kind of soil that the Californians would give their eye teeth for, which is we have a lot of limestone soils here. Limestone soils tend to increase acidity in wine, and acidity in wine helps the wine live longer. So the Californians, frankly, they won't admit it. They wish they had our soil. Secondarily, though, those Californians, let's talk California for a second, in so much as they wish they had our soils. They have about the same elevation in most cases that we have, but they're close to the ocean. And what that does is it moderates the temperature. Now, we're right smack dab in the middle of the country, and so we get these crazy swings of temperature. You know, the Alberta Clippers coming down. The one I remember, the Easter Massacre of 2007.
Yeah.
You know, it had been above 50 degrees for 3 weeks in March, and then in April on Easter Day, the temperature plummeted to 15 degrees, and the sap had risen in so many plants. Then it froze and they broke open. They just burst. We lost 95% of the wine crop in the state of Missouri.
When you have these great swings in temperature, how can you, I mean, you
grow different grapes. You grow other grapes. So we can't grow the grapes that they grow in California. We can't grow the grapes they grow in France. I mean, people do. There's one good guy.
But they take a chance.
He takes a real chance. Michael Omagani at Omagani Vineyards. He grows Cabernet Franc and such, and he has to fight it every year, and that's fine, but
he knows what he's getting into.
He knows what he's getting into. Most other people will use grapes that are really have been bred and in fact crossbred to survive these kinds of conditions. We call many of those grapes hybrids because there's a Native American, I should say a Native Eurasian variety called Vitis vinifera, and then there's about almost 24 different Native American varieties, and they've been crossbred in some cases to provide a grapevine that's more likely to survive our winters, and maybe even worse, our really hot, humid summers. We have so much humidity.
Well, that's a kind of an interesting, because for every, let us say, profession, growing grapes, and there are lots of corollary jobs to that, and one is hybridization of grapes.
Yes.
I mean, whatever you're interested in doing, you can apply it to the making of wine.
Yeah, indeed. It's interesting, too, because a lot of the best work in hybridization until very recently was done in France a century ago. And the irony is that in Europe, it's illegal to grow those grapes.
Not here, though.
But not here. No, we get it. That's what makes it possible here. So we see grapes like Vignoles and Vidal Blanc, and then newer grapes that have been hybridized only recently, like Traminette, which I think is a fantastic grape.
Is that a red?
It's a white grape.
Grape.
If it sounds like Gewürztraminer is one of its parents. So it has this wonderful.
So that's
floral
kind of a
nose.
sweet.
It can be done dry, but most of the time we'll do them a little bit sweet here because our grapes in this area with these limestone soils are so tart that we add a little bit of sweetness. Otherwise, for many people, these wines are to be just too drier and more tart than you get out of California.
Did you hear him say a floral nose there?
That's true.
I caught you.
Yeah, it's true. It is a little floral. Another new grape called Valvin Muscat, which also has
Now that's
wonderful,
a dessert wine.
It usually is, but again, I've had some dry versions of it. Blumenhof makes a really wonderful Valvin Muscat. In fact, those of us who judge at the Missouri wine competition went nuts over it this year. It's a fantastic wine.
Can a vintner make a living to starting out?
Well, you do have to hit a certain number of cases before you can pay the bills.
When you say cases, that's not kegs, that's cases of wine?
Cases of wine, say 12 bottles in a case typically. But yeah, about 8% of all the wine consumed in Missouri is actually Missouri wine. And that's a very encouraging number. That means there are 100...
I try to buy local.
I do too.
I do.
I really do. There's 100 wineries in Missouri that are making
100? How many in Kansas? There are quite a few too.
In Kansas, we're at about close to 30.
See, I just think that is absolutely amazing. It is. What do you do with them in the wintertime? Because in Europe, where they're grown, we don't have such cold winter. They don't have such cold winter. What do they do with the grapevines in the wintertime?
Well, most of these grapes will winter pretty well. But the worst of them, if you will, and certainly anybody growing the typical grapes of vinifera, a lot of them cover them up with hay and straw and bury the vines during the winter. You
know, they say that wine makes every meal an occasion. It makes every table more elegant and every day more civilized. I thought that was really interesting.
I'd like to believe that's true. It certainly slows the meal down, which a lot of us think is crucial to really getting the benefit of a meal with friends and family.
In the time we have left, I want to talk about the wine labels. What should one look for when they look at the wine label? Well,
some of them, I had to bring this one along. This is one of my favorite German wines. It's missing the
Uh-oh.
I mean, you know, the idea really is it's this old label, and so everything's on the neck. And I can read this for you. It is Moses Aruva, Eitelsbacher, Kartesis, Hofberg, Guts Äpfeln, Kartesis. Yeah, I mean, it's just like,
it sounds to me like you've had too much wine for breakfast.
I think I have. It's true. No, it's a lot of times there's just too much information on the labels.
Yeah. Well, it is. What do you look for? I mean,
well, I think it's very difficult. Honestly,
this one's more simple.
Yeah, exactly. When it's a brand, the vintage, the region it comes from. Honestly, what I beg everybody to do is find a retailer that you trust and that knows your palate, because we're all very different. Some people like sweet wines, some people don't. Some people like very big and bold wines, some people like lighter and milder
But the
wines.
year that they were vinted makes a difference too.
Oh,
the
agreed.
same wine in a different year may not be as good.
And that's exactly the reason,
Yeah.
to your point, Mary, exactly why I think you find a retailer who doesn't say, it's got 92 points, therefore you'll have it. Because unless the guy who gave it 92 points is coming over to dinner, who cares, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
Instead, what matters is having a retailer who says, well, you really liked this wine over here, right? And you can go, yeah, I love that wine. You remember I wanted to buy more of it, but you ran out. Well, I've got the new vintage from those guys, or the new vintage isn't quite the same. Why don't you try this one instead? I mean, that's when people tell me, oh, I can get this for $2 cheaper at some other place, I think they're crazy, because the condition that ought to, you know, pertain here is, can I talk to somebody who knows my taste,
Well,
who will show me something I like?
Well, but for $2 or $3, what you're trying to do, in my humble opinion, is complement the meal.
Indeed,
So
that really is.
Why
all
would
you're
you
trying
drink
to do.
something that tastes terrible?
I don't know. You know, because some distant, faraway critic gave it a score, should have nothing to do with what your preference is.
Well,
if you really, you know, are good friends with the critic, great. But
well,
you know,
a lot of us
otherwise-
look at these wine magazines, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
And
I,
so, yeah.
I just think it's all about personal taste. It's very personal, just like food is personal. I don't particularly, let's say, like chocolate, because I really don't. But I love liver and onions. I would, you know, argue that I'm abnormal in this, but everybody's abnormal in some other way, and we don't think that's weird in food. But in wine, it's the same way. We like different things. We should.
Well, and it's absolutely true. You have lots of other jobs too. You're the consultant for an airline on their wine purchases.
Both United Airlines and Continental Airlines. Yep.
Their food is sort of pedestrian. How do you? Is that difficult?
Well, actually, it is, in so much as wine becomes less volatile at 30,000 feet. So I actually have to choose wine slightly differently, because I know they're going to be consumed way, way up in the air instead of at ground level, and it does change them a little bit.
I think I would suggest to you that since you took these 2 exams, the art of wine has changed a lot, hasn't it?
You're right. You're absolutely right.
See, I just think so.
There's so much more wine available than there was when I took this exam. There's so many more good wines available. I honestly think today, people often think I'm blowing smoke, but it's true. There are great wines that are made in this region.
See, I think so too.
Yeah, and
I do.
And when I took these exams 20 years ago, I believed that it was possible, but it's become reality since.
Well, and I think the message is buy local if you can.
I agree.
I do.
Completely agree. Food-wise, wine-wise, beer-wise.
Absolutely.
I think it's true.
We all need to support our neighbors. And I have to say, Doug, as I thank you for coming, Doug Frost is just the best guy in the whole world, and even if you have all these certificates, I just think it's wonderful. And I think it would be appropriate for us together to say to all our neighbors, our toast to you today is, may we not grow old, but mellow like good wine.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you so much for being with us. It's our community, and I'm Mary Davidson. We'll be back